Sparta's government, like much of Spartan society, contained recognizable features of virtually any Greek city-state, but with a peculiar twist. In this lecture, we will cover some of the basic features of this constitution, in the hopes that an appreciation for the whole of the system will make appearances of individual features, like the ephors or the kings in history books, make a little bit more sense in context. The Spartan system, the elements of or features of the Spartan system worked together so well and in fact so completely depended upon one another that the Spartans themselves of the historical period assumed that they must have been invented by a single lawgiver, a hero whom they called Lycurgus. Supposedly, Lycurgus asked the god Apollo at the Oracle of Delphi to give to him the wisest and most functional form of government that was possible, and Lycurgus passed that along to the Spartans. Interestingly enough, Lycurgus the lawgiver was not a king. He was supposedly the younger son of one of the royal families or the other. Different accounts assign him to one family or the other, who served as the regent for the boy king of the other family. Today, we don't believe that Lycurgus was really a historical figure. Rather, the general assumption is that the Spartan system probably evolved organically. The most distinctive feature of the Spartan government is definitely its diarchy. By the end of the Dark Age, virtually all Greeks had done away with their kingships, and the new city-states generally operated as aristocratic oligarchies. In a few cases, the hereditary heirs to the old kingships retained some priestly duties and a few privileges, maybe like front seats in the theater. But they had by and large been stripped of all their real power. In Sparta, on the other hand, the kings remained, but with a catch. There were always two of them. So a diarchy, and not a monarchy, was what the Spartan kingship was. The story that the Spartans told about why this peculiar arrangement came about is that the early Spartans were led into the Peloponnese by a chieftain named Aristodemus, the great-great-grandson of the mythical hero Heracles, or Hercules, the one with the lion skin headdress. Aristodemus's twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles, ruled as joint monarchs or as joint rulers after him when they settled in Laconia, and from then on, the two boys' heirs inherited a kingship one kingship each from their forefathers. The slightly older twin had a son named Agis, and after him, the senior Spartan royal family was called the Agid dynasty. The younger twin's grandson, Eurypon, gave to the junior royal family its name, the Eurypontid dynasty. Now, today, historians seriously doubt that this story is anything but a legend meant to explain the origin of the double kingship. Perhaps a more likely hypothesis can be found in the failed Synoikism that we talked about in the last lecture. If the Spartan villages, or obi, refused to give up their full individual identities in the formation of the Spartan citizenry, we can imagine that maybe a couple of the chieftains of the villages refused to yield to each other and would only share power instead. And then this shared power persisted over the generations and became traditional and solidified in the double kingship, or the diarchy. The Spartan kings had some special religious prerogatives, but their main function in the government was to serve as the sole commanders-in-chief of the army. Ancient Greek philosophers divided governments into three broad categories: monarchies, in which kings ruled; oligarchies, in which a council of aristocratic peers ruled; and democracies, in which all free male citizens could vote on laws. Sparta had what the Greeks furthermore called a mixed constitution, which combines features of all three. There were the kings, who we've already talked about. Then there was the aristocratic council, called the Gerousia. The Gerousia debated proposals that would become law, and they had the ability to prevent a motion from being brought before the assembly for a vote. Then there was the slightly more democratic institution of the Apella, or the Spartan assembly, made up of all male Spartan citizens. In order for a law to be passed in Sparta, it had to be ratified by the assembly. The Spartan assembly, though, was not truly democratic, since only men who owned a certain amount of property and good standing in Spartan society could exercise their rights as citizens and voice their vote. Incidentally, if you're curious, a vote in the Spartan assembly was taken by acclamation, that is to say, by shouting, and the side that shouted the loudest would carry its motion, yea or nay. The archaic Spartan poet Tyrtaeus appears in your reading for this week. We know that the Spartans held him in great reverence because his patriotic poems were used as marching songs throughout all of Spartan history. According to legend, Tyrtaeus fought among his Spartan peers during the Messenian Wars, and his patriotic poems were so rousing and inspiring that they brought the Spartans to victory. In one poem, Tyrtaeus describes the Spartans, quote, eunomia, which is a Greek word that means literally having good laws. But the word has the added connotation of stability of government. The best laws, to the Greek mind, were the ones that changed the least from generation to generation. Supposedly, then, the proof of the superiority of Sparta's system to other Greek systems was its persistence. And Tyrtaeus gives a summary of how that system worked, or at least was supposed to work. According to this fragment, the Spartan government is supposed to work with the kings debating policy with the Gerousia, or the elders, and then the assembly was supposed to agree with what the elders said. This, according to Tyrtaeus, is what the god Apollo intended, and following these guidelines would always give the Spartans victory. There were three main classes in Spartan society, the first two of which are shown here. First, there were the Spartan citizens, who are called the Spartiates. They are also called the homoioi, which in Greek means something like the similar ones, so we call them the peers. These formed a numerically very small number of people in Laconia, actually. However, they owned virtually all the farmland in both Laconia and Messenia as absentee landlords, and they collected their land's produce. They also enjoyed privileges like voting in the assembly, but they were subject to a very regimented lifestyle of military training and drilling for most of their adult lives. The perioikoi, or literally the ones who dwell around us, were the free Laconian residents who were not entitled to Spartan citizenship. The lives of these people was probably a lot closer to the lives of other Greeks living outside of Laconia. They practiced trades and crafts like blacksmithing or baking, or they could be day laborers. They made a living selling their wares, and they could also be drafted into the Spartan armies. but only as foot soldiers and never as officers. Commands always came from the Spartans. Then there were the helots. You can think of them as serfs. All Greeks practiced slavery, but the Spartan system was particularly dependent upon it. Enslaved laborers, mostly in Messenia, but a fair number in Laconia too, worked the farmland for their Spartiate landlords and kept only enough for themselves to subsist on. They were politically and militarily powerless, but they vastly outnumbered their Spartan overlords, and so they were kept in place by an all-pervasive culture of fear. Tyrtaeus imagined an idealized Spartan system wherein the wise council of elders made its deliberated proposals and the assembly obediently agreed with them. In practice, by the classical period, the Spartan assembly had developed the means to exercise some degree of political initiative on its own, apart from the council. Every year, the assembly elected 5 ephors, or overseers, to represent it. The ephors could then propose laws to the assembly as well as the Gerousia, and they also claimed the pretty powerful right to put members of the Gerousia and even kings on trial for misbehavior. The ephors also performed a yearly ritual that was central to the Spartan way of life. Now, murdering a human being, theoretically even a slave, was a religious offense in ancient Greece, as well as a civil offense, and it made the murderer an enemy to the gods. The only exception to this rule was killing that was done in battle. So, every year, the ephors declared war on Messenia. By artificially prolonging the Messenian wars of centuries ago, the Spartans could claim the right to kill any Messenian, that is to say, any helot, without any consequences.